All right. Well, good to see everybody out. Time to begin our services or our Bible study this morning. So appreciate everybody being here. This is good hibernation weather. I'm sure the majority of people in the world would rather be doing nothing but sleeping or hiding under blankets today. But thank y'all for being out here. Gray, rainy day, but it's always a beautiful day when we could fellowship together. This morning in our class, we're going to go through Lesson 11 and the books, Be at Peace with One Another. And there's one more class in this series left next Sunday. It will be Love One Another, and then we'll complete this book. Now, just looking at the calendar, when we get to January, it seems a little bit loud to me. Let me drop that down. Is that okay? Can y'all hear all right? Not too loud, not too quiet? In January, Donnie will take the class on Sunday morning. But if we finish this book next week, that leaves one more Sunday in the calendar year on Christmas Sunday. So what we'll do then is we'll just have a standalone class until we start the new series with Donnie in January. And I'll share more detail on that next week, but I think what we'll do is just a one-time class on the nature of Jesus. Looking at the first chapter of Colossians and looking at the first two chapters of Hebrew. Study the divine nature of Jesus while a majority of the world celebrates a birthday, what they believe to be his birthday. We'll study the divine nature of Jesus. But for today, we'll study class 11 in this book, Be at Peace with One Another. Let's turn to Matthew chapter 5, and we'll read from one of the Beatitudes. But before we read that, let's ask somebody to lead us in a word of prayer. Charles, would you lead us in prayer to start our class, please? Thank you, Brother Charles. All right, so Matthew chapter 5, when Jesus is opening the Sermon on the Mount, he goes through several Beatitudes. In verse 9, Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." Blessed are the peacemakers. And then if we turn to Mark chapter 9, verse 50, Mark chapter 9, verse 50. Jesus also says later on, "Salt is good, but if the salt has lost its saltiness, how will we make it salty again? Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another." So we see another, one of the one another phrases, be at peace with one another. So Jesus tells us, blessed are the peacemakers. They shall have peace. They shall be called sons of God. And we're also told to be at peace with one another. So be peacemakers and be at peace with one another. You know Jesus' wording. He's not saying be people who enjoy peace or people who like the thought of peace or peace talkers or peace dreamers, but peacemakers. So there's some action implied here. Not just be people who like peace, but people who make peace. Making peace is a lot better than passively enjoying the state of being at peace. So before we go further into this, let's go and study what that means. What does peace mean in the New Testament? So I brought the Vine's Dictionary with me. And as usual, once we start looking at biblical definitions, we see a lot more depth to that definition than we normally see in just our everyday talking definition of peace. I think when most people think about peace, they just think, it means that you aren't currently fighting, or you aren't currently at war, or you aren't currently arguing. But if you look at Vine's Dictionary, there's multiple aspects of peace, and I'll just read a couple of those. So the Bible, the Greek word, describes peace as a harmonious relationship between men, a harmonious relationship. Now, we don't usually use the word harmonious in our everyday language, but what does that mean? What does harmony in music mean? Together, in tune, okay? And together, in tune, harmony in music. The opposite of harmony in music is when you have an orchestra and you hear one violin that needs a tune and you just hear that one orchestra screeching like nothing else. You know, the opposite of harmony in music is dissonance, when somebody hits the wrong note. And you can have 50 people in the orchestra all together, but you hear that one out of tune violin that hurts your ears and it kind of overshadows everything else. Harmony means that they move together in chords. You know, the chord is a pattern of music that is, you know, sounds richer than one note alone. So when we apply that to man, harmonious relationship, we're in tune with each other, we're together. Together we can make something that's more appealing or more beautiful or more healthy than just one person alone. Vines also describes peace as freedom from molestation. So freedom from some trouble, some strife, from somebody actively working against you. Vines also defines peace as order in the state, in the churches. So order between groups. The state and the church, orderliness between them so that there's coordination and communication. There's also a definition. Peace is the harmonized relationships, there's that word again, harmonized relationships between God and man accomplished through the gospel. So biblical peace is not just a harmonious relationship between people, but is a harmonized relationship between God and man. So not only are we in tune with each other if we're at peace, but we're also in tune with God. We're following the pattern that God has. Harmony follows patterns in music. If we're at harmony in God, we're following the pattern that God has for us. Peace, there's a lot of definitions of peace. There's about 2 pages. We aren't going to go through everything, but peace in the Bible means the sense of rest and contentment. So peace is rest and contentment. You know, Jesus says, "Come to me, you who labor, I will give you rest." So peace is a contentment and rest from the gospel. And then going back further, sometimes the Greek word peace in the New Testament is a Greek translation of the Hebrew word shalom. I think we've all heard that term before, right? Shalom, Jewish word for peace. Well, that's used in the New Testament also, and that signifies wholeness, something that is unhewn. We don't use that, but unhewn, uncut. If you go and take an axe to firewood, you hew it, you cut it. So shalom is wholeness, not being cut, being full or finished. So there's this sense of entirety. If you were at peace with God, then you aren't split. So if we go and we want to be peacemakers, we aren't just going to be trying to settle arguments. We aren't going to just be trying to get people to talk to each other nicer. That's more the worldly sense of the word. If we were peacemakers, we're going to be working actively to be at harmony with each other. We're going to be working actively to be whole as Christians. We're going to be working actively to be in harmony with God by following His pattern there. So if we're going to be peacemakers, it's more than just liking, not arguing with people. So there's a lot of definition there once we start to look at all the different senses of the word that we see. Let's turn to Philippians chapter 4. After defining the biblical sense of peace. And thank y'all for bearing with me. I like these word studies. Peel back a lot of layers to some things that we don't normally think about. Philippians 4, let's start in verse 8. Finally, brothers, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if there's any excellence, and if there's anything worthy of praise, think about these things. what you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. So the God of peace will be with you if you practice these things. So we're familiar with this passage. We're told to basically meditate on the things that are higher, meditate on God's ways, the things that are just, noble, commendable, excellent. So if we want the God of peace to be with us, then we need to be meditating on the things of God. We can't just be trying to avoid arguments and be at peace. Again, this meditation on God's ways comes before the God of peace being with you. It takes work to become a peacemaker. One of the first steps is dwelling on God's ways, which leads to peace. And then if we turn to Hebrews chapter 13, let's turn to Hebrews chapter 13, verse 20 together. Here the writer says, "Now may the God of peace, who brought again from the dead our Lord Jesus, the great shepherd of the sheep, by the blood of the eternal covenant, equip you with everything good, that you may do his will, working in us that which is pleasing in sight through Jesus Christ." So here, may the God of peace equip you with everything good, that you may do his will. So what we read in Philippians, meditate on God's ways so that you may be supported by the God of peace. And then here in Hebrews, the God of peace will equip you with everything good, that you may do his will. I think that's part of that harmonized relationship with God. You seek the way of God, you meditate on the ways of God, and he will equip you, he will be with you. Talking about a harmonized relationship. So again, being a peacemaker is not just enjoying the state of being at peace, but it is actively working to be with the God of peace, to be equipped by the God of peace, to meditate on the ways of the God of peace. Any thoughts on these passages? All right, so how does this apply to one another Christianity? If we actively work to be peacemakers, if we actively work to be equipped by the God of peace, how do we apply that to being peacemakers and being at peace with one another in the context of one another Christianity and being parts of the same body? Let's turn together to Ephesians chapter 4 and look at some practical things and have some conversation on that. Really quick, Romans 14:19 says, "Therefore let us pursue the things which make for peace, and the things by which one may edify one another." So Paul says, pursue the things which make for peace, and we could talk about that here. So Ephesians chapter 4, verse 1 through 3. Paul writes, "I, therefore, a prisoner of the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace." So, if we're going to be peacemakers, then we need to maintain the unity in the spirit of the bond of peace. So here, peace is the bond. The bond holds together unity. If we're going to be active peacemakers, then we need to make sure we are maintaining the unity, which makes the bond of peace. It all ties together here. So if we go and step through verse 2 and look at some of these characteristics, now we start talking about some things that we could work on every day. We can work on these things every time we encounter each other, every time we fellowship, every time we study. And we can work on these things while we are in the world, at work, at school, in our social lives, wherever we go. So, in verse 2, Paul goes through a list of characteristics. Humility or lowliness. Paul urges us to walk in a manner worthy of the calling with humility. So we've studied these before. What does humility mean if we are walking with humility or lowliness? I'm ready for some of y'all to start talking. humility, humbleness. So, and how does humility or humbleness or lowliness help us to be peacemakers? How does humility, lowliness, how does that help us to maintain unity and peace among another? Were you starting to raise your hand, Kent? Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, so peacemakers, some members of the body may be stronger peacemakers. I believe we should all strive to be peacemakers, but some people in the body might have a greater gift for empathy. They might have a greater gift for, how they talk to people, being able to calm people down. So I think Kent brings up a good point. Some members of the body could be stronger peacemakers than others. That's something we should all strive for, but we can't do that without the humility or loneliness that we see here in Ephesians. If we're going to be peacemakers and do so with humility or loneliness, then we need to recognize our own imperfections. We could all make mistakes. We could all accidentally add to an argument or stir things up. If we're going to be peacemakers, we have to do so with humility because we can't be thinking better of ourselves than others. We've got to have that lowliness and that humility so that we could go and talk to people and relate to them and try and stretch out the olive branch, if you will. You can't do that if you're walking around proud and haughty. It's really hard to be a peacemaker if you're acting like you're better than everybody else. You're talking about, siblings arguing and then a sister stepping in to break it up. I was wondering over here if Hope was relating to that a little bit, being a peacemaker within the family. As goodness knows, we see how plenty of that. Carrying on through Ephesians chapter 4, walk in a manner worthy of the calling with humility and gentleness. So gentleness here. How would showing gentleness help us be peacemakers and preserve the unity in one another Christianity? Gentleness. When I think of gentleness, sometimes I think about holding back a little bit, holding back your strength, holding back your words. If you're going back to the, kids arguing, we're often saying, be gentle with one another. If the kids are arguing, they could be pushing or shoving or raising their voices, shouting. Say, be gentle. When we say be gentle, we're basically saying hold back your strength, hold back your volume with your voice. Hold back your strength, show grace to each other. Kara?
Holding back your emotions, having self-control.
Yep.
It's so easy to let it all come out. And all the ugliness and your overflow of emotions pour out all over everybody. And it never helps anything. And it's being gentle. There's some people who, when they're not gentle, it's like gasoline on fire. It changes, it lets everything go.
Yep. It's holding back your emotions, your strength, your temper. your word choice. Now, sometimes you got to raise a voice to get kids' attention if they're arguing. Sometimes you got to, pop them, get their attention one or the other, but you don't have to do that for every single thing. You don't have to yell to get everybody's attention. You got to show gentleness and hold back. So that applies to kids in the home, obviously, but that also applies to how we talk to each other. Hold back your strength. Use gentle words, and not everything has to be an argument. So if we're going to be peacemakers and preserve the unity in one body, in one another Christianity, we got to hold back our strength, hold back our emotions, hold back the strength of our words, and show grace to each other. Moving along this passage, next, Paul says, with patience. Walk in a manner worthy of the calling with humility, gentleness, and then next, patience or long-suffering. So how does patience or long-suffering help us to become peacemakers in the body of Christ? So I think we say hold back and take your time, right? Don't rush to speak. Don't rush to act. Don't rush to jump to conclusions. Show patience and give things time. Yes, Pat.
I would also like to say patience, of course, means waiting. We have to wait for some things. In the Bible, it says many times that we have to wait on the Lord. And sometimes that's really hard for people to do, is just wait. You have to wait till things get calm or till the person gets calmed down or something.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that easy sometimes.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's hard to wait. Mm-hmm. We don't like to wait. We're pretty impatient people. We like results. We like action. We like things to happen quick, fast, and in a hurry. But to be peacemakers, we have to be patient, long-suffering. We have to wait. We have to wait to give people a chance to make things right or explain their side. If we jump to conclusions, if we're impatient, we can make things worse, right? So we got to give others a chance when there's issues. Let them share their side or let them go and try and make things right. Don't get mad too quick. Say, well, something bad happened. Well, let's make sure we aren't jumping to conclusions. Let's get all the facts. Let's hear both sides of the story. Again, going back to the kids, really important if you think about child raising and then applying that to the church. When you have one upset kid, of course, they are the perfect victim, and the other person is just the bad guy. But once you hear both sides of the story, if you're patient enough to hear both sides of the story, you hear a little bit more going on, and usually it takes two to tango, right? But if we aren't long-suffering, if we aren't peaceful, then we won't get to that point. Bill?
We live in a world that's been taught the squeaky wheel disagrees. And it's really hard to get to where you can just have the patience and have the gentleness and kindness. But that's not the way the world is. We as Christians have to work real hard at it.
That's true. Kim? Giving each other time. So yeah, it's our culture, we're a pretty fast-paced culture, but no matter what rush you have for the outside world, we always got to be able to slow down for each other. We got to be patient with each other. We got to give time to each other, so we don't jump to conclusions or rush into judgment and make things worse. You jump the gun, you'll make things worse. Moving on in Ephesians 4, humility, gentleness, patience, walk in a manner worthy, with bearing with one another in love. So bearing with one another. What does Paul mean here by bearing with one another, and how does bearing with one another help to be peacemakers in the body of Christ? Mm-hmm. Yep. Put yourself in their place, walk in somebody else's shoes and see where they're coming from. I think we can't bear with one another if we aren't patient with one another. Even we won't be able to be patient with one another if we aren't humble and gentle with each other. So these attributes all kind of add up to bearing with one another, putting ourselves in their shoes, enduring together. I think going back a page or two to Galatians chapter 6, we see some of that thought. Galatians 6 verse 2, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law. Bearing with one another has a sense of enduring with each other. You go through the fire together. You endure together, you suffer together. You kind of hang tough together whenever somebody's going through a trial. So if we're bearing with another, we can't do that without patience. But if we're bearing with one another, we have the humility, gentleness, and patience to go through hardships together, share some suffering together, and help get through it together. Now, we can't be peacemakers if we see somebody struggling. We step back and say, well, it's their fault. I'm going to watch until they're done. We can't preserve the peace that way, because if somebody suffers alone, then they might become embittered to people who didn't help them out in their time of need. So we need to look for opportunity to bear with one another in humility, gentleness, and long-suffering, so that we could preserve that unity and preserve peace together. Any thoughts on these passages? Larry?
Sometimes people struggle with this brother, like a kid on the wall. Sometimes it's all the time too, where the kids out and then sometimes we have to allow people, even people that work with me sometimes, right? Like they do make some mistakes, or they learn a mistake, be better at it, grow more perfect. And I think that's part of life.
Yep. Getting through mistakes together, and that's part of the learning too. Yes, sir.
Relating to what Larry said, I think that attitude is important. Some people are suffering because they make bad decisions that result from a focus on themselves and putting themselves first, and not considering other people, their environment, and just things around them. They just go through life and they're in pursuit of pleasure and serving themselves, which eventually leads to misery.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, a person can make a choice. They can have a good attitude and want to change, or they can just continue on. And I think what we need to do is we need to use judgment and look at what the person, can they do it? Do they need help? Are they trying? Or are they just not
Obviously we've got to use that kind of discretion or judgment. Is this the time to let somebody go through hard things and learn on their own while they got a bit of support in the distance, or is this a time to jump in and get something, made right before they go and hurt themselves? So I think Kent, and then back to Larry.
Going to what Larry said and what Will said, when you're working with people, one of the things you may not even talk about, may get to, is honesty. You have to know enough about the situation to know what's going on and be honest enough with the individual to tell them what they're doing wrong or what they're not doing, could be doing. The old saying, a true friend will tell you the truth. You know what I'm saying? And that's what, when you're working with someone who is struggling and they're made, like Will said, they're making bad decisions, for example, you need to be reminded that these decisions you make is what puts you here. You need to make different decisions. Rather than, I'll be there to help you and support you. But part of this is for your learning process. You got to figure this out too. I can't do it for you.
Yep. Yep, and that's how we got to learn. You got to learn some things the hard way, but with the right support structure in place, not left to your own device where you might be making things worse. Good comments. Now, back to you, Larry.
Building on what Kent and Will said, we need to let them struggle, but we also need to be there and move with there if they need it. But first step has to be yours. I mean, if the good Lord died for us, but we have to take the first step to come back home and say, if we don't do that, then no matter how much riches is piled up there, there's no value to it.
Yep. So going back to being a peacemaker of this conversation, in order to be a peacekeeper, sometimes you got to let people struggle and figure things out the hard way, like we're talking about. But there's got to be somebody there on the other side, ready to help, ready to catch them, ready to help teach or bringing them back into the fold or whatever needs to be done. Because peacemaking is not just one person's job. If there's somebody struggling, they need to go and help out. They need to help be peacemakers too, whether it be they're struggling with behavior they need to correct so they could be at peace, at harmony with the others again. But a good conversation there. And going back to that patience, sometimes that patience means we're going to take a step back and let somebody realize that they need help, or let somebody step back and learn the lesson, a tougher way so that it'll stick better. Yep. Sometimes if we rush in, we take away the opportunity to learn. Enabling? Yep. So staying in Ephesians, we read about the manner which Paul tells us to walk: humility, gentleness, patience, bearing with one another. Now if we turn to verse 32, Ephesians 4 verse 32, it says, "Be kind to one another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ forgave you." So concluding this chapter with these thoughts. Again, attributes to show to be peacemakers, kind to one another. I think we know what that means. If we're kind to each other, we're caring, gentle, we're understanding, and I'd also say approachable. It's hard for somebody to go and ask you for help if they're struggling if you aren't kind to them. I think that kindness means you're approachable to people that need help. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted. I think tender-hearted, we think being sympathetic, being able to sorrow together, being able to share comfort together. If you aren't tender-hearted, then you won't be able to go and open up your heart and give comfort to somebody who's struggling or who needs help. And forgiving one another, we studied that in depth the other week, talking about forgive one another. One of the more difficult things to do. But as Jesus forgave us, as we need to be forgiving to others, obviously. We got to be able to put things behind us and let go of grudges and forgive one another so that we can be peacemakers with one another. So any thoughts on these passages so far? Now we could back up a verse to Ephesians 4 verse 31. And we could read about things which destroy peace. So Ephesians 4, verse 31, back in the verse, Paul says, "Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice." These things here, sins of the tongue, we studied this the other week in one of our other classes. And we don't need to go through all these definitions, but the bitterness, wrath, anger, clamor, slander, those are all things which tear apart peace, right? So as we go through our walk, if we see this among the brethren, then as peacemakers, we need to be able to pull people to the side and say, brother, sister, as there's some bitterness here, there's some wrath, there's anger, and we got to work on that so we can be at peace with one another. So being peacemakers means that sometimes we got to do the difficult task of identifying these behaviors which split up peace and address it. If we turn to Galatians chapter 5, verse 15, similarly, Paul writes, "But if you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another." Very possible to be consumed by another if we let biting, devouring, tearing each other apart become part of our relationships. So if we're going to be active peacemakers, we need to be watching for any of this biting, devouring, anger, bitterness type behavior, be able to work with our brothers and sisters, make sure that we aren't consuming one another. That could happen really quickly if we aren't careful. Galatians 5, verse 26, skipping down a few verses.
Before you get any further, focus a little bit more on that word malice.
Mm-hmm.
Malice means the intent to do another wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But it's in the brain before it's ever done.
And that's a good point.
It's in the emotion before it's ever done. That's the intent to do something wrong. That's scary stuff.
Yep. That's a good point, Kent. Thanks for pointing that out. Malice. So not only do you avoid all the things that you say and that you do, but the intent. It all starts in the heart, right? So before we can prevent any evil words or behavior towards one another, we have to be able to prevent that evil thought, that malice, that evil intent. Cordell?
This malice comes from, that's where we get our word malignant. That's not a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Fester. So malignant, festering, rotting. Those intentions will go and rot us all apart from each other, right? Yep. We can't be at peace with one another. We can't be in harmony with one another if we allow malice, if we allow this maliciousness to grow and fester and, kind of dissolve our bonds. Kara?
That's why Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount talks about murder in the heart and murder in the heart, because it all starts in here, and when you are called on to be patient, you're not just called on to wait quietly, meaning there's no noise there, to be quiet on the inside too. And that's a much harder thing to master, to tame yourself on the inside and have the perspective and the attitude with patience. It's not enough just to be quiet on the outside, because you can have wrath and frustration and vexation building up inside of you, and eventually it's going to come out in a really ugly way. You have to, like I said, having every thought what is the word?
I'm drawing a blank right now.
The scripture, and every thought of ours has to be under his control.
Mhm.
I can't remember the word, but it's a really hard thing. It's definitely
Yep.
the hardest thing I've ever tried to do in my life.
Yeah. If you got pollution in a lake, you got to look upstream the river. You got to look up the river to see where it's coming from, right? There's always a source for the bad things that we see. And I think that's what we're getting at here is if we're going to go and resolve any of these behaviors that tear apart peace, we got to go and look at the heart where that maliciousness, where that malice comes from. And going back to Philippians 4:9, meditate on the ways of God so that we could prevent that from developing in the first place. Will? Okay. You want to read that out loud for us? 2 Corinthians 10:5. Um, The point being, you got to be able to go and destroy the festering thoughts that lead to the divisive behavior eventually. If we don't put that malice out of our mind, then sooner or later that's going to result in some sort of bitterness or ungodly behavior, which destroys the harmony of our relationships, right? So things to avoid there. Now let's continue that thought in the few minutes we have left. Let's turn to 2 Timothy. Again, things to watch for. If we're peacemakers, these are things that we should watch for so we could resolve it, so we could preserve the peace. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 23 reads, "Have nothing to do with foolish, ignorant controversies. You know that they breed quarrels. And the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, but kind to everyone, able to teach, patiently enduring evil, correcting his opponent with gentleness." And we'll stop there, but, have nothing to do with foolish, ignorant controversies. Lots of times as people will make arguments where there shouldn't be any. I think about relationships that have been damaged by people arguing about sports. At the end of the day, sports doesn't really change how we ought to live our lives, but people allow relationships to be damaged by arguing about sports or something like that. Their favorite movie, favorite video games, sometimes people get into arguments. You go online, you read comments and articles where people are just arguing about nothing. So if we're going to be peacemakers, we need to be ignoring ignorant controversies that just breed quarrels. Now, that could be something secular, like sports. That could also be ignorant quarrels for things within the church body. Let's say that we're going to go get new chairs. I just looked at chairs for an easy example. Let's say that somebody wanted to get red individual chairs like this, and then another one wanted to get a traditional long wooden church pew. And they started arguing about that and losing their temper at each other. Well, is that anything that's worthy of destroying relationships? I've been in men's business meetings where there's an argument about the color that we ought to paint the foyer. Not here, but previously. There's nothing wrong with talking about paint. There's nothing wrong with debating what color paint you want to use. But if that turns into an argument among the brethren, then that is an ignorant quarrel. And as peacemakers, we need to watch for these things and say, brothers, we need to be at peace with one another. Don't argue about things that don't matter, but going back to Philippians 4:9, meditate on God's ways. Meditate on the things that are higher. So our time is up. Next week, we will conclude this book with love one another. And then the week after that, we'll study the nature of Jesus, first 2 chapters of Hebrews, if you want to go and read that, and the first chapter of Colossians. But appreciate all the comments. It takes a lot of work to be peacekeepers. There's a lot of things that tear people apart in this world, so let's all leave here encouraged. Let's all leave here ready to be peacemakers between ourselves and also so it could be a light in the world. Thank you, everybody.